Hi, welcome or welcome back everyone to another episode of Ask a Speechy, episode 11. And we are having a fantastic guest today. Dr. Lutza Ireland is with us and we're going to have some amazing conversation. First of all, I've got two first questions. How are you? And maybe if you can tell our audience a little bit about yourself and the work that you've been doing.
I'm good, thank you. It's Neurodiversity Celebration Week this week, so it's been very busy and eventful for us neurodiverse folks. I'm a psychologist and designer, and I'm an ADHD and autistic woman. So it's been lovely to see this year that neurodiversity is trickling down to the mainstream a lot more, with a lot more employers wanting to become more aware and inclusive of neurodiversity. So second part of your question is what I actually do. I have a bit of a mixture of a background. So I'm a psychologist, but I have finished a doctorate in design. And I did a bit of a merge interdisciplinary project. So I looked at mental health literacy, which is the knowledge and application of skills that encourage good mental health in self and others. And what I researched is, how can we make mental health for something that can be quite stigmatized and difficult to talk about into something quite cool and something that people actually want to talk about and know more about? And so my idea was to use interdisciplinary methods of interaction design and visual design, because if you look at a lot of success of social media, really a lot of it is enabling people to see visuals and interact with a topic. And I thought to apply those elements to mental health.
That's very, very interesting. I'm sure there's a lot to talk about there and a lot to unpack. But just to make sure I understand the work, when you mention mental health literacy, that basically mean the ability of one to sort of be sort of understand mental health and multiple aspects of mental health. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And one interesting part about mental health literacy, similar to literacy, when we talk about literacy, we often think that it's about being able to read, but it actually goes beyond that, because it also includes that we don't just want to read something from letter to letter. We actually want to understand what we read about and then decode it into a specific knowledge, and then be able to apply that knowledge when we need it most. So often when we talk about mental health literacy, generally the public health version of mental health literacy is really pushing towards people having increased ability to, for example, recognize different mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and so on. And that's, of course, very important, because if we are aware of something, then that enables us to do and respond in a way that will hopefully make our lives better. But what can be quite tricky about mental health literacy and all literacy and knowledge is that knowledge is really quite dynamic. So it might be that I know about anxiety and I know that deep breathing is very helpful. It doesn't necessarily mean that if I'm really anxious, I will also know that this is the time for me to stop doing deep breathing. So that's one thing about literacy, that one important thing about it is being able to apply what information we have and apply it across different contexts. So not just theoretically, but in the moment when we need it most as well. And another part of mental health literacy, which is part of what came out of my research, is that it's also very important to be able to critically examine what leads to good mental health? Because often we use a very individualized approach. And the same with the neurodiversity movement, who said that, for example, autism, dyslexia, ADHD is not an individual problem. Often it is, in fact, the barriers in the environment that create the problem, not the different conditions themselves. We need that criticality for mental health as well, and be able to say that if someone doesn't have a secure job, they have money issues, relationship issues, they don't have access to proper education or healthcare, then odds are that they're going to be stressed and anxious. And it's nothing to do with their stress and anxiety management skills, rather than stress and anxiety is a consequence of not having equitable access to certain services.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember we very briefly touched base on this new concept to me, by the way, because I've actually, it's a fantastic way of seeing things, I think. And so maybe you can tell me about the research that you've done, because I know that you've been receiving many awards for some of the work that you've done, and I've actually had a look at it, and it looks really, really amazing. So maybe you could tell me a bit more about the research that you've done and the work that you've done as well. That'd be great.
Oh, cool. Feel free to stop me, because I can go on and on about that. I absolutely love this this type of research. So basically, where I started at was I had an initial idea that it would be great to develop an app that allows people to get access to skills to manage their mental health if and when they need it the most. And the more and more research I've done, I started to use human-centered design and participatory approaches, which means that instead of me taking charge and saying, for example, I'm a psychologist, so I'm very well qualified to know what's going to work for people, we invert the process and involve the end user into the design process, and ask them, what is it that you actually need? What is your knowledge? What is your lived experience? What are your values and priorities? What is a dream product that would help you basically bridge the gap between knowing about a skill, for example, and being able to apply a skill? And so when I started to listen to people, I basically ran 7 workshops with 3 different end user groups, and they were young adults, mental health professionals, and carers, by way of caring about someone who has had experiences of anxiety in their lives. And during these workshops, we really mapped out what people need to feel like they have more knowledge of mental health. And so what actually came out of these workshops is that people didn't want an app, because even to use an app, sometimes having knowledge and understanding yourselves is the first way to it. So if you look at currently existing mental health apps, many of them are very focused on giving tools and techniques. And of course, that can be very, very useful. But unless people know what specific tools and techniques suit them and their unique experiences, they can end up, for example, using tools that might not be relevant or not be helpful, or even if they use them, they might not know how they work and how they can apply to their lives. And one of the easy examples about this is, for example, going back to deep breathing and anxiety. I'm pretty sure that every person heard about taking deep breaths to calm ourselves down. Most people don't do it, but I think it's often interesting to hear that 10% of people actually feel better rather than worse when they use deep breathing. And there are reasons for that as well. But many of the apps would be built around modifying breathing or using different mindfulness or meditation techniques, which also have a very high, about 10 to 30% of people who actually feels worse rather than better after using these techniques. And I was thinking that if there was a medication that has a 30%, 10 to 30% chance that it's going to make you feel worse, you'd probably put a massive warning label to it. But with these apps and with these different techniques, we take it for granted that it's just going to work, and we don't have to worry about it. So essentially, during this research, what people wanted to know more than what to do for mental health is understanding who they are as people and understanding who other people are and the fact that we are different. So, for example, anxiety and stress could look very different for you than it looks for me. And instead of saying, oh, this person is smiling, they're probably feeling good, it doesn't, it's no proof that they are feeling good. We can say, when I'm smiling, I feel good, but we can't say, therefore, everybody who's smiling is feeling good.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I actually have a question on that, on stress and on anxiety. There's been a study made. There's been a scientific study made on stress and how it impacts your cognitive ability. And I think how they did that is that they took two group of students and have them pass a test. And one group was under a test environment, so it was timed, and there was a supervisor in the room. And the other group were just pretty much just go in the room. There's no time. There's no one here to supervise you. You can just go, take your time, and go through the test. So basically, the level of stress was much less. And it turns out that there's about 20%. That stress, generally based on that study, is sort of taking away 20% of your cognitive ability. But my question to you, though, is, it seems to me that, and that's just an assumption, I don't know about this, but maybe you can confirm or not this, that stress and anxiety are good for you, but when it's too much, it actually reverse. Am I correct by saying this? And by following that up, is when do we actually know that it's too much? Like how those are very, very non-tangible things. You can't really, touch it. What's your view on this? Because I've been fascinated by those things,
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I would expand on that by saying that stress and anxiety are really useful, but too little can be just as difficult as too much. So an example of that would be that if for example, you have an elite athlete, if they don't care about winning and they don't have that stress and anxiety that would get their body ready to win, they wouldn't really, for example, run fast, because if I don't care whether I win or not, I'm not going to perform at my best. So basically, the sweet spot for stress and anxiety is when they are in the middle. So stress and anxiety often have a bell curve. Sorry, I just lost you there for a second. Yeah. Stress and anxiety often have a bell curve that you kind of imagine like this. Yeah. And if the stress and anxiety are too low, you don't get geared enough to be able to be productive. If the stress and anxiety is too high, as you said, it impacts your functioning to the point where you're so overwhelmed by the experience of stress and anxiety that you can no longer function your best. So the optimum is really in the middle, when stress and anxiety makes you care about something enough so that you have, for example, adrenaline to help you snap into gear, but not so much that it overtakes and
Mm.
activates your fight or flight response, where our cognitive responses are just decreased.
Mm. So it's kind of like trying to stay in balance with all those different metrics, I would say, or you know, feeling. And I want to come back to the concept that you've highlighted about this view of saying, well, when you're out of balance with your stress or anxiety or whatever, then it's not the individual that's the problem. It's actually what's the environment around that individual that causes this imbalance. And so maybe tell me a bit more about that and sort of unpack
Yeah.
this very cool way of
So
thinking.
that's a bit of a yes and no question. What I would say is that with stress and anxiety, or generally mental health, we are looking at health, not just mental health, but health in general, being quite dynamic. And it's generally an interaction between a number of factors, which include you as an individual as well as the environment. So one of the best ways of understanding all these different factors of mental health is through the biopsychosocial theory, and that's what I used as the basis of my research as well. So the bio part of biopsychosocial is biology, which is basically saying that each and every person has a specific biological wiring. That's where neurodiversity comes in as well, that we have different ways for our brains and nervous systems to be wired. So each person has a biological given in many ways that we can modify a bit, but ultimately we have a baseline that that is very strong. And the psychological part is about having a temperament, which can be also something that we are born with. Some people are more anxious by default. Some people are more adventurous. Some people are more calm. This is something that just comes with us. But psychology is also about the way we think. We think about the world, we think about ourselves, and it's also about the behaviors that we do. And then the social part is the environment and all the influences that we have, the socio-political, environmental influences, whether it's at work, the healthcare system, friends, family, school environments, all of that. So ultimately, mental health has these three very significant factors of biological, psychological, and environmental. And just because you said a really cool research story, I wonder if I may share a story that I found very fascinating about stress and how it can manifest differently. They did a research study with two sets of children. One group of children had very stressful, quite traumatic life circumstances, and the other group of children didn't have traumatic circumstances. And so what they did, they put the two groups of kids into two rooms, and they started to play a recording so that in the rooms, children could hear people arguing really quite viciously, and then they measure their stress responses. And what they have found is that both of the groups, the stress response went up, of course. And when they went into the room and said, okay, by the way, it's just a recording, the group who didn't have traumatic experiences switched off their stress response, thinking, okay, there's no real danger, happy days. And the kids who had quite traumatic experiences before, even though they were told it's just a recording, no stress, no one is arguing, they were like, yeah, cool, get it. But their stress responses went for a lot longer. And that's one of the very important things to understand, that we ultimately have a different type of stress sensitivity. So some people, when they get stressed, their stress shoots up very high and very fast. And even if the danger has passed, it can take hours or sometimes even days to come back to their baseline, which is, I guess, their normal, so to say. And other people, they might get stressed, they might get just a bit stressed, and if the danger has passed, they calm down in a second or so, couple of minutes, and they go by their days.
Yeah, so it seems that it makes sense that we're all different to some extent, because we all experience stress. So in that way, we're actually exactly the same. But how we have that is different. And so so you've mentioned during our last discussion, you've mentioned universal design. And while my understanding of this is designing so that the design or whatever is being designed can be used or interact with by the majority of the population. And that means, it could be used by blind people, by deaf people, and sort of like maximizing the design usability for society. Am I right by saying this? Probably a terrible description of it.
Yeah. No, it's very much the core of universal design, to really focus on inclusion and accessibility for all people. So at the moment, often what we can see in workplaces is that people's access to modifications, reasonable adjustments, reasonable accommodations, whatever words we use, are often done in a one-on-one basis, generally requiring a medical certificate. So instead of someone being able to say, I process information in an auditory format a lot better than in a written format, and people can go, well, sure, no problems. Then for you, here are the things that we can do to help that. Generally, what happens, have you been diagnosed with dyslexia? Do you have a medical certificate? Have you talked to HR about a reasonable adjustment process? And that's something that might enable a couple of people or a few people to get, I guess, I don't even like to call it reasonable accommodations, but have access to the type of environment that enables them to work productively. But that can be a really slippery slope, because often what we forget, for example, about reasonable accommodations is, even if people get it, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. So very often I have heard people saying that, I think it would be very useful for me to have certain types of reasonable accommodations, but I'm really worried about what my colleagues say, because I heard that when Betsy got some special accommodation, everybody was saying, oh, Betsy's getting special treatment. I wish I was like Betsy, and why can't I have XYZ? Which can be very, very difficult. But if we say that that universal design, which is essentially inclusive design, is based on universal inclusivity, then what we are saying is that instead of focusing that Joe can access speech to text software because Joe is dyslexic, we can say actually a lot of people process information in different ways. So we have picture thinkers, we have word thinkers, and so it makes sense to be able to present information in many different ways. So that means that we might use multiple channels of communication and information processing so that we are able to offer people the choice to choose what their preference is rather than asking for medical certificates. So then if we say this information is available on video via transcript, or you can see bullet points, or you can see a diagram of that, then we're not asking people individually to ask for a modification. We are saying choose whatever suits you best.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually super true. And I've had those conversations before about multiple medium of communication because not only this will certainly help people who could have learning disorder or anything specific, but it could also help someone who haven't been diagnosed with anything and who probably don't have anything different, but just learn better by watching the video. And you know, those things to me seem so obvious and just a no-brainer. As you know, as an organization, it's like if you could have the information by text and by video, then you're just increasing your chance of making your team more productive because they will be able to pick what they want to digest. And you know, it's the same thing as this study about stress, where they're sort of shown. I think I'll have to put the reference in the description of the episode. I will, but you know, those kind of thing. If you manage to prove that, you know, when you're under stress, everything that you've learned at school, you know, you could be very good, and when you're under stress, you lose 20% of that ability of being able to pass the test. And if that's true, we should probably multiply every single mark in the world by 1.2, right? To sort of add this extra thing, and then people could pass, you know? But so how would that, is there any other, I'll call them things that you're aware, apart from multiple medium of communication? And to me, that's definitely something that should be done, and that's just, and specifically right now, it's super easy to do. I mean, how hard it is to take a video, it's very easy. I mean, you could have some anxiety doing it for sure, but you know, you don't have to film yourself. You can maybe, you know, but is there any other aspect of universal design apart from multiple medium of communication? Is there anything like, I don't know, like design in shape, or you know, whatever? Do you know anything else?
Yeah, definitely. So the main point of universal design is that it really shoots for universal benefits. So it's not just for cognitive and neurological differences. It's basically saying that we want to put inclusion in front of diversity and focus on how can we accommodate the largest amount of people regarding not just neurodiversity, but also cultural backgrounds, any different types of diversity that is actually very important for people and their lived experience and their identity. So we're not just talking about communication channels, but we are really talking about different policies and procedures that encourage inclusion in general. And some of the big ones that I think would give the biggest bang for everyone's buck is being able to have flexible work. So that includes being able to work from home and being able to modify your own time, of course, within reason. So still have core working hours. It's not a pass as a free-for-all, but just saying that if someone is more productive in the mornings, then they might have more meetings scheduled in the mornings, or they might start working at 7 in the morning and finish earlier. Whereas for me, if I could start at 10 every day, I would absolutely do that. Being able to work from home or remote access is incredibly important, because when you talk about stress decreasing cognitive capacity by 20%, it can decrease it by nearly 100% as well. So when people are really tired, or sometimes when they have traveled, say, an hour on public transport, I know I have very high sensory sensitivity. So whenever I'm on the bus, which I'm trying to avoid most of the times, there's very strong air conditioning on the bus, which is very difficult with my sensory processing, because I feel the air moving on me as I sit there. For an hour sitting on the bus, for me, that tires me more than 8 hours work straight. So my capacity after an hour of bus ride would actually decrease by more than 20%. So I usually get to the office and I have 10 minutes of just quiet space, and an environment where nothing is kind of blowing on me, no fan, no aircon, and then I get back up to my baseline and are able to work. So all these kind of things are so unique and specific to people. A lot of people can travel on the bus. A lot of people love to sit under the fence because they enjoy these sensations, but I don't. So instead of saying fans are good or fans are bad, we can give people the choice to either come to the office every day or not come to the office every day. So it's really about the policies and procedures that makes the biggest difference.
That's super interesting, because I would say that there's also some technological limit that we have in that regard. And you're totally right. In that example, actually being able to choose whether you want to work from home or not is a direct solution to that scenario that you've highlighted. On the other hand, on the long term, on a long sort of like scope, you look at this and you say, well, maybe there is some technological limit that we currently have that sort of can't, that unless we discover something new, would sort of allow for a more inclusive experience. Who do you think has more responsibility to this? And, I'm talking about adult life. I'm not talking about education here. I'm talking about working adults, people who just, start their life into work. It seems to me that obviously there is, the individual has a responsibility, that's for sure. We're not saying that, hey, you don't have to do anything. Of course, you need to be aware of what's going on. But it seems to me that there are two main actor apart from yourself as an individual, and that is government, which is policy, what you mean, and then also companies and organization. And what do you think about this? Like, what's your view on what would be a good scenario, and how do you think we should approach this and try and make society more universal, I would say?
Oh, that's $1 million question. It's very, very interesting, and your question relates to something that in design we call a wicked problem, which is not to say that it's an evil problem. What it means is that this is such a complex issue with so many different stakeholders, because you mentioned the government, the individual, workplaces, but we also have the healthcare system, families, friends, neighborhoods, communities. There are so many stakeholders with so many different values and priorities in here, that if we are trying to simplify the process and saying this is the solution, we're going to actually create more of a mess than before. So some problems, these wicked problems, they can't have a simple solution because we have too many stakeholders with too many priorities. And so instead of trying to shoot for a solution, at this point, we need to ask more questions rather than trying to give more answers. And we need to map out what we are dealing with, and really understand these stakeholders and how they interact and what the different consequences of the different actions that we are proposing would be. But also we can start applying good practices. And some of the good practices are applying, for example, this universal design, inclusive design principles at work. So we might not be able to solve everybody's access to work, but if we, for example, provide quiet spaces for sensory breaks for people, that will not only have help neurodistinct people who have higher sensory sensitivities, it can also help people who may be pregnant or who may be hungover for all we know, or people who just might need a bit of thinking space along from the hustle and bustle of an open plan office. So we don't have to solve everything. We can just start doing what we can bit by bit, measure how it works, and improve on that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, for sure. The problem seems very, very complicated. And as you do in mathematics, you break down the equation and try and solve a small part of it first before.
That's right. That's right. And I would
Yeah.
also mention that there is a lot to be said for job design, meaning that not every job will suit every person, and not every job is suitable for every modification. So, for example, if someone is a doctor in ER or they are a paramedic, it's very unlikely that they can do flexible working from home because it's not conducive to doing their jobs. So in that case, if, for example, somebody is like me, that they find it quite difficult to travel a lot on a day-to-day basis and have very quick shifts from one environment to the other, quite frankly, it's easier for me to not become a paramedic than for me to spend many years at uni and then try to get accommodations so that I don't have to go to too many locations in a given day. And by the way, all my respect to paramedics, because they are doing an incredible job.
Yeah, that's for sure. Specifically for during this time, it's been really
absolutely
crazy. And I think I was walking. Was it in Melbourne? Yeah, I was walking in the city maybe 2 weeks ago, and there's those big photo of nurses and other allied health professionals who've been struggling during COVID, and it's really great to see that. And so, what do you think? I mean, I'm going to talk about dyslexia because that's really my subject. But so it's clear. I mean, there's been a lot of study that sort of confirmed that dyslexia is the world's most common learning disorder. If you look at, depending on what study you look at, there's between maybe 10 up to 20% of the population in the world with some degree of dyslexia. And it's fascinating when you look at the history that this thing has just been completely go back 50 years ago. There are some country who said that dyslexia doesn't exist. I think Australia organized a report. I think it was in 1800, and they came back to the conclusion. They were going around the country, around different country, I think, and they were sort of analyzing this specific learning disorder, and came back to the government with a report saying that the dyslexia doesn't exist in Australia.
Wow.
I think that was in 77. I'll have to find a source, and I'm going to put a lot of source in this recording. But it's interesting, and I'd like your view on this, because dyslexia is not something that's tangible. For example, you could know me for years, and if I don't tell you that I'm dyslexic, it's very little chance that you'll actually notice, unless we're in class together and you actually figure out that I'm actually completely out of whack when it comes to reading and that stuff. But apart from this specific environment, you actually can't tell that I'm dyslexic. And I wonder if that's the reason why dyslexia has been so it just came under the radar, and it seems that now it's started to sort of kick off a little bit with big organization who sort of lobby towards dyslexia and that sort of thing. And what do you think? What's your view on this? And do you think that the fact that dyslexia is actually not tangible could be a good reason for it to just have been going on for years, and is just sort of recently start being much more awareness campaign and that sort of thing? I'm not sure. I'm yet to sort of like try and get my head around this, but I think that the fact that it's not tangible is one of the biggest reasons why it's such a mess. And it's very easy to think that the kid is lazy or is not trying hard enough, that sort of thing. What's your view on this?
I definitely think that as it is with any invisible conditions and ways of being, dyslexia can be often masked by other factors. And I guess, what is that saying, that if your only tool is a hammer, you're gonna see everything as a nail? I think often this is what happens, especially, I guess, back in the day with different parts of education and different priorities. When people are very focused on, for example, achievement on tests, and tests are predominantly written, and the way we tend to learn is predominantly through written information, then unless there is a really upfront knowledge that as much as 10 to 20% of students might not prefer to have written information and may have difficulties with written information, it's just easier to put down to laziness or people not trying hard enough. Or often when kids have difficulties with materials, it's easy enough to zone out and act out, because what else can you do? There are no other ways for kids. They can't say, I'm dyslexic, I find it difficult to read. Their immediate thought is often, other kids are doing these things and I can't do it, so that probably means that I'm stupid, which is of course not at all true. But for a child who knows no better and doesn't have a clear path of saying, yes, in fact, not everybody can and has to read and write in really high quality ways, that would then allow kids and their environment as well to be more aware and accepting of the fact that we have different learning styles, and maybe reading and writing is not the be all and end all of learning. There are other ways of learning, there are other ways of knowing as well. I don't know if it answered your question, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that dyslexia can often manifest in a way that people look at the consequences, and the consequences might be low grades or behavioral difficulties because kids are frustrated by not being able to do something that they want to do. And so we often pay more attention to the behavior rather than the cause of the behavior. So just like with everything, when we see a problem, whether it's kids not achieving their full potential, we need to really assess the root cause. Why is this happening? And as soon as we start making assumptions based on our worldview, is when we don't actually find the root cause, is when we try to chuck supposed solutions at a problem that we are convinced is the problem, but ultimately it might not actually be the problem.
Absolutely, that is so true, and it's very hard to do. And it actually comes back to what we've discussed before, which was instead of sort of look at both sides of the equation, so look at the individual and also look at the environment. And it's very easy to look at the individual, specifically when it comes to behavior and things like this, because that's the first thing that you see, and it's right there. So it's kind of, it actually requires some sort of, what would you call it, awareness to be able to step back from the current situation and say, hang on a minute, maybe there's something external to this current situation and feeling that I have about this student or whatever, and then let's try and explore that. And if there is nothing, then, you know, but maybe there is something there. Lutza, it was amazing having this chat with you, and you know, I'm sure there's so much more to unpack with the design theory and the universal design, and then this massive problem of how do we solve that. I'm sure that there's much more, but I really appreciate you being here. And before we go, maybe you can tell us, where can people reach out to you?
Probably the easiest way to find me is on LinkedIn, or you're very welcome to visit my website, which is matrixdh.com. And as you mentioned earlier, there is a stress and anxiety guide, which is a graphic field guide for COVID times, which is built on some of my PhD findings, and that's a free download from that side. So if you'd like to know more about stress and anxiety, then please download the guide and let me know how you liked it.